Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Leadership for Navigating Change. My name is Duncan Field, and I'm a community animator here at the Tamarack Institute. And it's my pleasure to host and introduce this webinar with Bill Fulton and Jody Harden of the Civic Canopy, as well as Liz Weaver of the Tamarack Institute. Now, just before we get started, we wanted to take a moment and reflect on the land that we're each gathering on. I'm going to begin this discussion by acknowledging that we're meeting on Indigenous lands, and as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we all thank the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Now, I'm calling in from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit in Mississauga, Ontario, and I encourage you to take a moment and share in the chat what land you're calling in from. Now, I'm going to pass it over to my boss, Liz Weaver, co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks so much, Duncan, and welcome everybody to this call. I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. So I think from Tamarack's perspective, we'd like to acknowledge the land as part of our commitment to truth and reconciliation. So I'm really excited for the webinar today and to introduce you to my colleagues, Bill Fulton and Jody Harden, who are with the Civic Canopy in Colorado. It's kind of interesting because in many ways, Tamarack and the Civic Canopy are engaged in similar, complementary, and parallel work. And so, you know, having the ability to co-author a paper with them about what we're all seeing as how communities are responding to the pandemic and some of the other complex issues that have been arising these last 6 months has been a real pleasure for me. But before we get into too much of the conversation, I just want you to learn a little bit more about Bill and Jody. So Bill Fulton provides strategic leadership for the overall organization at the Civic Canopy, ensuring that the Civic Canopy's models, methods, and mission are carried out through its projects and lived out through its culture. He founded the Civic Canopy in 2003 to create a comprehensive community change platform to help communities transform individual efforts into collective action. He has over 20 years of experience in team development, collaborative problem solving, multi-stakeholder dialogue, and results-oriented network development. So Bill brings a lot to our conversation today. And then Jody, who is his colleague at the Civic Canopy, guides the organization-wide strategies, securing the partnerships and resources needed to develop and deliver the Civic Canopy's core services and support offerings. She applies a strategic lens to all of the Canopy's project areas and supports team members to ensure fidelity to the Canopy's community learning model, which we're going to learn about in a minute. Jody's also known for her expertise in strategy and systems development, cross-sector partnership building, and connecting often disparate efforts into a more cohesive whole, in addition to content expertise in the early childhood system. And I guess, you know, I should introduce myself as well really quickly. I'm Liz Weaver. I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Learning Center and of Tamarack itself. And I lead the collaborative leadership thought area within the Tamarack Learning Center. So Bill and Jody, welcome to you today.
Thank you. It's always fun to see you, Liz. And thank you, Duncan, for kicking us off. It's always fun. And to see so many folks sharing where they're from in the chat. It's great to see folks from across the United States and Canada.
I feel the same sense of warmth and excitement of, as you mentioned, Liz, being longtime friends and students and colleagues with you. It's delightful to get a chance to do this webinar together, and excited to see people from our different networks really represented in the chat. It's great to, it's like a kind of a family reunion where we haven't all met each other before, but know we have something in common.
Yeah, it's always great to connect into the folks that are joining us, and particularly the folks that are really interested in, this topic. And so during the course of the topic and the discussion that we have between us, all of you who are listening in, feel free to post questions in the chat box or post questions in the Q&A. So Jody and Bill, I'm going to start off with a question to both of you, and you can decide who wants to go first. Maybe Jody. You're both leaders at the Civic Canopy in Colorado. So can you tell us a little bit more about both the Civic Canopy and your work? And, what are some of those areas? I mentioned a few, but what are some of those areas that you're focusing on right now?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, so we're the Civic Canopy. We're a nonprofit, community-based nonprofit, like you said, based in Colorado. So the majority of our work is in Colorado. We we have done projects and bands of work in other states as well. Our mission is to create the conditions where the many can work as one for the good of all. So our work really centers around building and elevating the skills and capacities of communities to address and solve the complex social issues that are most at the heart for community change. And really, a couple of years ago, we realized our work centers around 4 core beliefs. And the core beliefs are related to the community learning model, which is the visual that's on the screen right now, which we use in all of our projects. But our core beliefs, the first one is that every individual matters and contributes. It makes us really think about how do you create inclusive environments where different voices and perspectives, especially those most often not heard and not leading, have a chance to contribute and be heard. Our second core belief is that communities are filled with assets and solutions. If we create really robust and open spaces for honest dialogue, sharing of perspectives, especially different perspectives, people have the chance to come together and identify what's the result that we're all working towards to get as a whole. Our third core belief is that the answers emerge from the collective, that really not coming in with a preconceived notion of what the answer or solution is, but if you get the right people in the room, have the open space, they will decide what actions to take and how to continually learn and evolve the work that they're doing. And the fourth core belief is that civil society is a place of caring, compassion, and love. That sense that outside of the business and government sphere, that place where we come together, we care about our neighbors, about each other, is a place where we build the culture of collaboration and caring amongst those who are working together. So our work itself centers around 3 strategies. We aim to build relationships, to build connections between groups of people and networks of people across communities, across the state. We work to develop capacity, to share skills, best practices, expertise, so those in communities can lead and drive the change that they seek, and to catalyze collective action, to figure out and support people to mobilize individually and as collective wholes, to address what's most important to them. So Bill, would you like to share some of the stuff that we're currently working on related?
Yeah. We've been fortunate to be able to kind of continue on with just project by project work and even long-term ones, even during this COVID times. But I think if I had to put 2 words on that have kind of really captured our soul in this last 6 months, it's equity and systems. I think on the equity front, while like many organizations, it's been a part of our work, it's at the core of our language and our vision. I feel like in the last 6 months, we've really had to take much deeper stock of what do we mean by that? How are we committing to it? How are we showing evidence of making a difference on it? And I think even more kind of robustly, how do we make sure internally as an organization, we've embedded equity into our full work in everything rather than adding it on as a separate initiative. And then on the systems building front, I think that's language we've always used about the importance of changing systems, the patterns that go with them, but trying to get more explicit on what does that mean? What are the implications in our work? And how do we elevate the individual projects that we might be tied to or the individual networks and help mobilize them to, frankly, to develop more power to change those systems that are not yet working, which have been so clearly even more revealed during the last 6 months.
Yeah, I think it's very true. It's like a parallel to the work of Tamarack. But what I love about what Jody said was this notion of doing the work with caring, compassion, and love. And you know, the my encounters with both of you and with all the team at the Civic Canopy is that that's lived out in the way that you do your work. And I think equally, I think the notion of systems and of equity kind of flow through the paper that we wrote together and what we'll be talking about over the next little while. So I wonder, Bill, if you can kick us off, and I've included as the next slide the graphic that we had in the paper, but maybe just let us know. You know, we started this journey of writing this paper a couple of months ago, although, you know, our collective journey has been, I think, 10 years in the making, when we found ourselves together in the universe, kind of, oh, you do that? Oh, we do that, and kind of agreeing to that. But we started to look at really trying to observe what was happening in communities as a response to the pandemic. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the early conversations that we had that kind of were the first formative steps that led to this.
Yeah, so it is funny, like when talking about a paper, it made it's easy to imagine that this idea was fully formed when we started, but really, especially in the early phases of COVID, I think what sparked, at least my recollection of some of what was exciting, is we were seeing in our respective environments interesting patterns that we didn't know exactly how to describe. I think some of those early conversations, apropos of your point about compassion and love, was just how inspiring it was to see these stories of communities coming together, caring for neighbors, cheering healthcare workers in the evenings. It just felt alive and spontaneous against the backdrop of this misery and fear and concern about the pandemic. And as we moved into the more social justice oriented phase of the last 6 months after George Floyd's murder, the conversation shifted a little bit. It's not enough to just be responding to your neighbors and to having that sense of immediacy. There's these deeper questions. And so we started seeing those patterns too, of the important role that collaboration was playing as a way to kind of sustain and support some of that responsiveness that we were thinking. And I think in the early forming of the paper, we didn't really know what was beyond that. But we all sensed that even the coalitions and collaborations that we were deeply familiar with and supporting and actively think of as our work, they weren't necessarily adding up to the leverage we'd need for systems change. And so I can remember some of the articles you would forward, Liz, and the thinking and the language you were beginning to use with some of your connections around systems leadership, or what is this next phase, really giving us the formulation of the broad categories. And I think, Jody, you were key in, at least in my thinking of, I have a tendency to want to, if we move from one to the next, the new thing is better than the other one. And I think you were a good reminder that, well, you know what, it's going to take all three of these layers. There's got to be the space of just responding to the immediacy of human need and that sense of responsive leadership that we began to flush out a little bit more. That then is tethered and stabilized by finding, collaborative spaces that have enduring structures and networks. And yet those enduring structures and networks are oftentimes constrained by the very systems that are inadequate to the task, whether it's funding obligations or patterns of leadership that are not necessarily as emergent. So I think we've invented, and we'll talk a little bit later, this third category of disruptive and emergent leadership, I think, is a placeholder for us to explore. We know some of the features of it, but I think we began to just kind of articulate there's something about the ability to distribute leadership as not as an individual trait, but a broad capacity. And so I feel like we learned along the way together over the last 6 months and began to kind of crystallize some of these ideas into the paper.
Yeah, and it's almost like these lines between the three should be plus signs rather than lines, right? That we need all three of them. That might be a iteration or a slight improvement that we make in the paper. So Jody, I think what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take each of them in separate forms and then look at the aggregate and where we landed. But Jody, do you want to talk to us about responsive leadership? And this, I think, we saw emerge quite quickly in the first few months of the pandemic.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the question of adding plus signs in between, because it is all of these options and different approaches. So the responsive leadership, the more as we thought about this, it's what Bill said, we all experienced. It was those really quick, nimble, let's do it. Let's jump in and get something done. Nodes of leadership that was happening during March, April, May. There was this sense at that time that we were all in it together and that we each had a role to play in helping to flatten the curve of spread of COVID and to ensure healthcare capacity. With the sense that things needed to be done, it was there was also time was of the essence as people and communities and economies were impacted in a variety of ways from the early shutdowns. So these responsive leadership nodes, like the three of us talked about it, we described them as being very adaptable and innovative, both adapting and innovating real time to the situation at hand. So things like cottage co-ops popped up of people willing to sew or create masks, first for frontline workers and later for the general public, as we realized that was a best practice for public health. This responsive leadership also created new and sometimes really unusual partnerships. So you saw things in communities where those who were doing food distribution, food security work were partnering with transportation providers in new and different ways to get food and resources directly into the hands of community. They sometimes were surprising how quickly they changed things that we thought were structurally challenging to change. So things happened like evictions were temporarily halted, at least in places in the United States. Unemployment and underemployment benefits were raised in a quick fashion by governments and deployed in different ways across Canada and the United States. After school programs were able to step in quickly and adjust their practices to be able to provide childcare services for frontline workers. So things that sometimes we thought would take a big lift to make happen were happening quickly and rapidly. And they included the public sphere, the private sphere, the business sphere. We also know that those early responsive leadership efforts also shined a light on the inequities that we knew existed, but they made them brighter. They made them stand out. That linked to then the social justice movement and really underscored that some of these early things were responsive in nature and may not be the things that actually change the infrastructure, the systems in a way that need to be changed for the longer haul. So some of the constraints or limitations, as the three of us talked about this, we wondered if the constraints to responsive only, or that the early responses may not have always gotten to the root cause of the issue. They created a stopgap measure, they addressed something, and in some cases, did they really were they able to go deep enough to actually change the systemic injustices? They oftentimes, because they were quick and rapid, did not or may not have fully engaged those most experiencing the issue. So then are those things designed in a way that will fully meet the needs of people in the future? And the other limitation we thought of with responsive leadership is, can a sense of urgency, to what degree can a sense of urgency be maintained over time? At what point does fatigue or that really rapid cycleness not allow for continued change at that kind of a rate, in that kind of a way? So those are some of our reflections on the responsive. Liz, are there other things you might add as we thought about the responsive leadership that we were witnessing?
Yeah, I think you've captured many of the points, Jody. I think I'd invite people to share in the chat box things that they noticed about responsive, the kind of how people have been responding, you know, both during the pandemic, but also during some of the other issues that our communities have faced, whether they're economic, whether they're equity-based, social justice-based. Just to notice what, share with us what you've been noticing in the community. Bill, anything that you have to add here?
I think that covers most of it. I just would underscore the juxtaposition of the sense of freedom and possibility that went with some of this type of leadership against the backdrop of this common challenges we were facing. I think for a lot of us, those are the stories that got most shared. Is, you know, just when you think everything's falling apart, is how the kind of positive spread of ideas, if you will, to use a dangerous metaphor during a pandemic, but it felt like we needed to hear the stories of what was possible as we were kind of withdrawn into our homes. So the emotional aspect of this too is, I think, critical.
I think you're absolutely right about that. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about the second kind of leadership shifting that we noticed. And this really centers on collaborative or collective leadership. And something that we've been noticing in terms of this work is that, you know, those communities that had pre-existing collectives or pre-existing collaboratives, all of a sudden, folks began to turn to them. So we saw government say, hey, pre-existing collaborative or collective, can you do this? Can you play this role in community? Can you be the leaders of this kind of change? And so that was a bit of a thing that we noticed. The other, I think, really important thing that we noticed around the pre-existing tables was that people who might have been more on the periphery of those tables, as we went more and more working, you know, in remote environments and in our remote home offices, people started to say, hey, I may not have been a fully participatory member of that table, but that table is meeting and they're talking and they're doing more work. And so those tables became a bit more robust in some cases, right? So people saw them as a way to connect in, to share ideas, to share resources, to share some of the challenges that they were facing as individual organizations trying to navigate the shifts that they were observing happening in the community. And so there's kind of an interesting pattern here in terms of these collaboratives. So at a time where there is, you know, this disruptive change, this kind of shifting that is happening in real time, we tend to, as communities, lean into pre-existing structures. And I think what we noticed was that those collaborative tables became very important. Tamarack did a case study of our vibrant community partners. So we have a network of about 400 cities across Canada that are engaged in place-based poverty reduction. And they identified in that case study, you know, how the work of the table shifted in response to different kinds of needs that emerged in the community. So they didn't shift all in one direction. In fact, what they did was they shifted in different directions, right? And it was really a responsive shift. And so, you know, the things that I would think about, you know, as we kind of think about pivoting post-pandemic or pivoting to the next iteration of this work is, what is core to the work that you're doing around the collaborative table, and where do you have that capacity to shift? Now, some of the questions that we raised in the paper were, you know, is this shifting, is this kind of responsiveness that we even saw at these collaborative tables, what are the resources that it takes to be able to enable that shift and to deepen that shift? And will we see this kind of deepening and enrichingness have a sustainability to it? You know, or do we go back to our old ways of working where, you know, we are sitting around the table, but we're not fully engaged? So it's really kind of thinking about how do we take what's happened over the last number of months and really deepen this collective experience around these tables, and then look at, you know, what is the difference that this collective experience is making on the health and the wealth of the community. One other thing I think we noticed around these tables was this kind of notion of beginning to look at wider and deeper systemic issues. And so an example that we shared as a case study is comes from Policy Link, which is a network of organizations across the United States, led by kind of a backbone entity called Policy Link that's looking at, you know, social justice, equity, and they really took this time during the pandemic to talk about, you know, how does our collective network build in a way that creates even more equity, creates even more social justice, really leans into some of the reforms that need to happen in communities, particularly around racial injustice. And so, you know, some of these networks that existed pre-pandemic continue to exist. They're deepening their work and their thought processes. And so I think collaborative leadership or collective leadership during the course of the pandemic and even today is in a state of, you know, we're doing work, we're thinking, we're responding to community, but what are we also observing in real time, and how do we make our work even more value add as we move from this phase into whatever the next phase might be? So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Bill, and maybe you have the more challenging of the three types of leadership that we've observed. And so one of the areas that we struggled with in terms of naming, we went back and forth a number of times, was this form of leadership that we eventually landed on as disruptive and emergent. So can you maybe describe, you know, our conversations and what we observed?
Yeah, so I'll come back to that, to the naming of it in a minute, but I want to pick up with a couple of things you highlighted there, Liz, and especially I think both Civic Canopy and Tamarack are so steeped in the collaborative space. I think that's, at least for us, kind of the go-to point of entry. You can convene a kind of a known stakeholder group. There's maybe a particular topic area or something that brings a group together. And I think we were definitely experiencing in our work, you shared the same within Tamarack, and I think we saw around us that the limitations of that premise, that people are coming to a table often representing an organizational framework or with a particular need, becomes what's inhibiting its success at a higher level. So if you might have come to the table working on food systems and the challenges around those, that whole group of that collaborative is well aware that food is connected to housing, is connected to healthcare, but there's simply no way to take all of that on. So the very premise and kind of starting point for some coalitions and collaborations feels like we can't get there from here. We can't quite address the things that are overwhelming us. At the same time, during the pandemic, when we saw, especially through the framework of Black Lives Matter and the spontaneous nature of marches across the country, across the world, I think we all got a taste of a different kind of leadership. There was no one central committee that you could go to and figure out where the local march was. It was broadly distributed. There was no even illusion of a group of people being in control enough to set this in motion. And yet, here we all were, part of something bigger than ourselves, making a difference, seeing things changing around us. You know, at local levels here in Denver, things that had been stalled for years suddenly became possible against the backdrop of this flood of kind of, we didn't know at all where we were going, but we were heading in the same direction. Things had to start changing. And so we began to identify, well, what are the hallmarks of this next phase of leadership? They're broadly distributed. Leadership isn't really a singular attribute or a role. It's a capacity of a collective to align itself, to make a difference, to share power and to challenge power. It has a sense of getting better over time, learning from each other, being able to take pieces that were examples in other places and incorporate them at a local level. Much of this, building on some of the language of complexity science, I think it was a big part of our discussions too. And in this feeling of efficacy, like the longing that I think people had for years, generations, even centuries of injustices that just had to change, that suddenly that whole machine was kind of, there was ruptures in it and the possibilities of it. So we didn't know exactly, on one hand, this is a disruptive form of leadership. It's challenging broken systems. At the same time, there's something emerging that's not simply about destroying what exists. It's also seeking to build. And so I think the hyphenated disruptive emergent is, at least amongst the three authors here, just saying, we don't really know what this is. We're just seeing the early phases of it in some ways, but we think it's kind of at least embodying these kind of tensions around needing to kind of creatively destroy things that are constraining or built on unjust foundations. And yet no one's in charge of defining singularly what that next stage is. So it's more broadly emergent. So I think and as true in these other forms too, it's not as if this is singularly the right form of leadership. There's all sorts of risks. I think we saw, and we are still seeing the opening of the streets, the marching in the streets and the peaceful protests gave rise to people using those spaces for wildly divergent purposes, people intentionally simply trying to cause chaos and undermine people's faith in government or whatever it might be. And so it's not as if this form of leadership is without difficulty. It's hard to align, it's hard to channel, it can easily devolve into squabbles over exactly what to do next. So I think we're just at the beginning of figuring out what this might mean. What does it mean to act in this way? But I would say categorically, it is oriented towards broader systems change. It's a way of taking collective action. It's a way of kind of moving towards and making good on a promise of equity that's been, hard to make progress on through our usual channels. And I think that's the hope behind bringing this to the table today to talk about with everybody is, are we naming this accurately? Or is this something that seems to resonate? How else would you describe it?
Thanks, Bill. It's interesting, right? One of the things that you just raised for me is this notion of the positive and the negative of each of these forms of leadership as it expresses itself, right? Because there can be really positive elements of responsive leadership, but then there can be also negative ones of judging and perception and these kinds of things. And just like collaborative leadership or collective leadership, there can be positive iterations of that, but also negative iterations of that. And I don't think we explored, I think we talked about the limitations in the paper, but that might be phase 2 of this paper, is to consider, what are those things that we really, those negative expressions, and then how do we course correct, or can we even course correct might be the question. So Jody, the question that I have for you is that we identified 3 forms of leadership, right? And we think that they're all kind of necessary as we kind of respond to the shifting and chaotic times that we're in. What does this mean to all of us, particularly those of us that are trying to work at the level of community change and trying to kind of push in a way that improves that caring, compassion, and love that you said so lovely about the Civic Canopy. So what is it about these forms of leadership that we need to pay attention to?
I think that's a big question. And that's why I think we were eager to kind of open up this webinar and hear from other folks about what they're seeing, what they're thinking, what they're experiencing. Because completely agree, like each and every one of these forms are valued and needed. And it's not that one is better than the other or more important than the other. So we know we had a sense writing this, we need all of these. We also kind of know that it makes us think about how, as community change agents, do we think about continue to shift our thinking, or maybe like it's something I think about a lot of, like that leadership is more of a verb or action than a noun, a person, an entity, a declaration. And I think I struggle with that a lot and think about that a lot, because I think it creates this opportunity for us to expand our lens that each and every person, every community member, every resident can and often does step into leadership, when we think about it this way, in different ways at different times and in different places. And how are we as community change agents helping to highlight or showcase that or call that out? That it's not the person in the front of the room or the person that's calling the meeting or the volunteer opportunity or whatever, that it's each and every person. And how do we continue to highlight and elevate that? I think it also helps us, what helped me with the way that we framed these three was pushing us to think, if our North Star is equity, a place where every person in society has what they need to thrive, then again, not one of these is not going to do that. It's the combination of, and especially stretching into what we're currently calling disruptive emergent, makes us think about that even more if that's our North Star. And I think about the disruptive emergent one a lot around trying not to put a capital letter around those, because then it becomes a thing that all of a sudden then there's, I'm trained, or that's what I do. Like, could you imagine the next round of interviews and people are like, what kind of leadership? I'm a disruptive emergent leader. Well, I think that kind of flies in the face of what we're experiencing or wondering about. Is it's not a personal attribute, it's a way that we're going about in the world, and we're going about it with other people in the world. So those are the things I kind of think about as we finished up and kind of were ready to share our initial musings.
Thanks, Jody. Bill, anything you want to add here in response to this question?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this will be work ahead for sure, but I think in some of the margin notes I've been thinking about, like, what are the attributes or the habits that go with each of these levels, and, roughly the responsiveness has to do, a lot with the heart, just being aware of needs and being willing to jump into action. It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to form a 501c3 to deliver toilet paper to the people on your block. You're just going to be responsive and step in. And so there's a habit of a willingness to care, willingness to connect and work. The collaborative layer has habits and skills about how do we do this effectively, efficiently, how do we come to larger tables and be willing to be a part of the solution and not the center of the story. But the last layer, I think, has something to do, there's that great phrase of, you aren't in traffic, you are traffic. The mindset shift of realizing that we tend to think of ourselves as the center of the universe, and we need to kind of become much more aware of being a part of a much larger story. So I think those mindsets that will go, like, if we could flesh those out, I think those will be a part of what kind of the leadership takeaways are for this. And it would be fun to kind of unpack that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, for those of you that are listening and commenting along in the chat box, think about those questions. Like, what are the things that you would like to see us kind of dive into a little bit more? Is it mindsets? Is it approaches? Is it the positive and negative sides of all of these forms of leadership? So I've got one more question before we open it up to the questions. And so I'm going to start with you first, Bill. So what do you hope that this paper and conversation will evoke? What do you think are the next steps? And we've kind of touched on it a little bit in our last conversation, but what do you hope? What are your hopes?
Yeah, I think I hope a lot. I mean, just seeing people being willing to join in this is one of them, that we can spark a nerve to continue the conversation. But I think when each of us wakes up every day and sees the world around us, oftentimes hopelessly complicated and with great cause for concern, my hope would be that we've tried to outline a way in which even the small acts of kindness and compassion and make sense as part of a larger strategy, and that the work we're doing in ongoing meetings amongst collaborators, amongst coalitions and stuff like that, is both for that work and as a vehicle of building these larger movements. And that if we keep our eyes open and we're willing to let go of some control and figure this out together, we can become a force of much greater magnitude together. And it will be about strengthening relationships, sharing stories, learning from each other. And, you know, by any means necessary, if we can keep coming to these same conversations and making sense out of that experience, I think that's the way forward.
Jody, what's your hope or hopes?
I think it's as simple as just continuing to build connections with other people who are experiencing things in new and different ways, and or visioning and hoping for the better, even better tomorrow, and how we're individually and as groups and collectives and communities showing up, and just being able to create that space of learning and stretching, and being inspired by each other.
Mm-hmm. Those are both really, those are great. I think from my perspective as one of the co-authors of this paper, you know, I've been thinking a lot lately about reflection. And so often in the chaos of really rapid change coming at us all the time, you know, we don't spend the time in reflection. And my hope is that this paper begins to have us maybe collectively reflect on what we're seeing right now and how we're responding, and, you know, what we're being called to, you know, both individually as organizations around collaborative tables, trying to push at the edges of that disruptive emergent, and then really kind of thinking about, you know, so what does this mean? The kind of what, so what, now what questions that we often use when we're thinking about change. So what just happened? Now, what does this mean? Which I think we tried to capture in the paper. And then, you know, now what do we do? Right. And I think that for me, that reflection, those pauses of reflection are so important. And I hope that more people will join us in that reflection. So now we're going to pivot a little bit and open it up to the question and answer part of the conversation, or pull in some of the comments that people might have shared during the course of the chat. And I can see Duncan is back with us. And Duncan, do you want to lead us into some of the questions that folks on the call are posing for us?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And just a reminder, if you do have a question, you can share it in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom client. And if you don't have a question, you can still use the thumbs up feature to vote on which questions you'd like answered. Our first question comes from Alice, and they write, perhaps change agents need to be comfortable calling out that the leaders are in the room and in the community. The question that occurs to me is, how do we equalize the power dynamics so those voices can be heard and listened to?
Jody, I'm going to pass that one to you because I think you would have some perspectives on this question.
Perspectives, and I think that the first thing that comes to mind is and it's so simple. So hopefully y'all can add to this. Is being willing to pause and be quiet and listen. Because I think those voices elevate when given the space, and it's not just the voices, but you see the shining, but it means that some of us who might be professionally in the work of pulling groups, collaboratives, tables, conversations together might need to be the ones that are talking the least amount in order to create the natural space for that to shine and be seen. I think it's also, and this is where it's like, I think it's a learning community kind of thing, being able to question and challenge each other and ourselves, to actually question, are we doing that? Are we creating a space that acknowledges and elevates the natural community leadership that exists? Are we truly being an asset-based, coming from an asset-based mindset? And recognizing the talents and connect, and allowing those to connect organically.
Bill, anything you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, one thing I think, just in the framing of that question, I think, Jody, you often remind me of is just even the assumption of the room that we're in. I think I'll plead guilty to often think about social change as a function of meetings and flip charts and structured activities. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about moving to the disruptive and emergent space is that it just broadens the range of avenues and spaces and ways of engaging in both conversations and direct action. So oftentimes power is determined by the very field you're operating in, and boardrooms and halls of deliberation come with their own encoded ways in which people feel comfortable and honored and valued. And as we expand beyond that and think about, houses of worship and parks and streets and communities more broadly, with that comes the natural lived experience and kind of authority that is properly accorded to folks who bring different experiences. So I think broadening our vision for where we're doing this work is one thing to help. And a second is one asset from this time has been the expanded understanding of essential workers and the role that different people play in the larger story. I don't know if we'll be able to make good on that. That may have just been passing kind of sentimentality, but it would be a shame if we didn't kind of make good and double down on at least a window of insight that this whole machinery of an economy, or the whole rules of the game that it is required to keep all of us alive and moving forward, hinges upon disproportionate burden on people that historically come from marginalized background, communities of color, poorer working communities, and that there's a chance to rectify on a broader scale the burden that's been borne there. And I have a feeling that window of opportunity may close faster than we recognize if we don't take action on it.
Duncan, any other questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Lisa, and they ask, what is your sense post-pandemic related to some of these leadership changes? How do you think systems will revert back or want to revert back to pre-pandemic ways? And how can we curve this?
I think I'll jump in first and then turn it over to you too. I think that's the question that actually I was struggling with in terms of even thinking about this idea, and reached out to you, Jody and Bill, because I was thinking, we are so often pulled back into our old ways of working. It's called Snapback. And it was a concept that was introduced to us at Tamarack by a woman named Brenda Zimmerman, who does a lot of thinking, or did a lot of thinking around complexity theory. And the idea of Snapback is that, unless we deepen the change in a real and methodical way, we can easily snap back, because there are so many things at play in the systems that we're working in the structures that we're working in the relationships that we have, and how we're funded, and all those kinds of things that just kind of pull us into this. And, one of the biggest fears that I had, while there was hope, my fear was that we were going to snap back. And so part of what I was doing for about a month there was talking to anybody I could talk to about, how do we not snap back? What are the things that we could be thinking about, that we could be observing? And I think that it really does call upon us to have that kind of pause and prevent ourselves from snapping back, if we agree that old way wasn't working, right? And if we agree that there are things that we could be shifting and changing, then how do we become part of the voices? How do we look at the different forms of leadership and recognize and value their contributions, and then say it's because of these things that we did this collectively? And I think that's some of the thinking that I've had really kind of front of my brain as we've been on this journey together. Jody, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking I got no answer for this question. I think it's $1 million question, and all I can think about is, how do I continue to surround myself with other people who hope for something similar that we don't snap back in that language, and surround myself with people who are willing to question, push, nudge, shove, so that we don't, and so that we actually do together create something better than what was in the past. So I think about it more about being in the places and spaces with people who are willing to push and nudge, and even my own internal change management strategy, because I can snap right back. So it's at the personal level, and then who and how I'm surrounded, and the type of work, type of spaces I'd like to be in, because I don't have the answer.
That was a pretty good answer for not having an answer. I would say once I was in there. One thought that has occurred to me, Liz, and we've chatted a little bit about internally as a team, is even the metaphor of snapback oftentimes has this presumption of a pendulum, that something has been given a lot of energy and it's pushing it up to a height of aspiration, and then we just fear it's going to come sliding back down. And even, this is often how we talk about political shifts. Some group will be insurgent and get more seats on a board or more representatives in Congress, and then it's only a matter of time before they. I think, and there's good reason to think in those terms. It's somewhat zero sum, and we certainly all in our lives have experience of wanting to make some big change and then finding ourselves not capable of it. But a different kind of mental model is an upward spiral, that we're constantly going around similar questions. How do we include the individual needs, but think about the good of the whole? How do we balance competing concerns? And our movement back and forth between those poles or tensions can also be a spiral that's moving upwards. And the hallmarks of more evolved thinking about that I think are a safeguard against some of this fear that we won't make the changes we need, are we simply replacing something with an opposite? Even in our own discussion of this paper, we tried to avoid saying collaboration is better than responsiveness and it supplants it, or no, it's really disruptive emergent. That's the top of the heap. We've tried to say everything transcends and includes what had it within it. And so you don't build enemies, you don't build resistance when you think about both and whether that's in a political environment or it's a method. There's no need to get rid of something that was working if we're adding something new together. So we may disarm some of the resistance to our new steps forward by simply thinking, how do we have both what has, what's worked before and a new addition to it, and commit ourselves to not going backwards, that we hold ourselves accountable to being able to say, we sent that letter out last year about our stand on equity. Here's what we've done as a result of that, and we've tried to move forward with it.
So I think we're coming to the end of our time. I want to turn it back over to you, Duncan, to maybe take us through our few closing announcements. But before we do that, really want to thank you, Jody and Bill, for both your contributions to the paper and good work that the Civic Canopy does, but also I think for this call, because I have an idea already for our next paper, and how we're going to maybe do something a little different. So I was writing it down as we were chatting. So look forward to that. But thank you so much for all that you do and the contributions that you've made. It's just been an amazing collaboration for us at Tamarack.
Right back at you, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Tamarack.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. I just have a few quick announcements to get through before we head out. We just have a few learning opportunities that I'd like to put in front of you. The first is, if you enjoyed today's webinar, we invite you to join us for our weekly free community building webinar series. We're running that through the fall and into the winter. We have a variety of topics we cover, from community change, systems thinking, evaluation, poverty reduction, and you can find out more at tamarackcommunity.ca. We also have a number of events or other learning opportunities available. The first is our brand new online course called Foundations of Community Engagement. And it's self-directed. That allows you to build your community engagement toolkit at your own pace through pre-recorded videos, resources, case studies, and a workbook. If you are interested in the community engagement part of today's discussion, this is a really great resource. You can also join Liz on October 29th for Turf, Trust, and Virtual Collaboration. This is an interactive workshop that focuses on the core leadership competency of trust building. So if you're interested in that concept and you want to spend a bit more time with Liz, I really suggest this. This is a fantastic workshop. And lastly, this is brand new, a Collective Impact 3.0 workshop. You'll join Tamarack Sylvia Chu and Liz Weaver for a workshop that dives into the collective impact approach and how you can use it to enhance the impact of community change efforts. You can learn more about all these learning opportunities at tamarackcommunity.ca. Lastly, everyone on the call will receive an email in the coming days that will include a link to a full recording of today's call, links to resources that were mentioned, as well as all the learning opportunities I just mentioned. Thanks again for joining us, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.